Hi everyone, welcome to episode 70 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. Before we get into today's episode, a quick note that after 16 months of back-to-back weekly shows, I'll be taking a few weeks off while I travel to the US and South America. I would have loved to bring my gear with me, but my girlfriend said she would kill me if I attempted to edit and publish podcast episodes during another holiday. So after this episode, I'll be back better than ever with new guests, a new segment of the show, and hopefully a few exciting announcements to make from mid-November. So coming back to episode 70, my guest for today's episode is Jason McPherson, Chief Scientist at CultureAmp. Prior to CultureAmp, Jason was a lecturer, researcher, and consultant at the University of Adelaide, combining computer programming with his main area of research in psychology. He then had several corporate roles before joining CultureAmp in August 2011 as its very first employee. CultureAmp has since grown to close to 150 staff with offices across Melbourne, San Fran, New York, and London, and earlier this year, CultureAmp closed a $20 million Series C round of funding. In this interview, we talk about how to measure company culture, hiring from a non-founder perspective, the transition and lessons from going from 1 to 150 people, and how to approach getting the first customer for your SaaS product. Without further ado, here is my interview with Jason McPherson. Hi, Jason. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Yeah, no problem. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, so I'm currently the Chief Scientist at CultureAmp. That title often, I think, started off as a joke, but it's stuck. So I'm stuck with it, and now people love the title. Even our clients love the title. So I ended up here at CultureAmp. I knew Didier through his wife, Didier, the CEO of CultureAmp, and had been speaking with him for a number of years about what CultureAmp was doing. And my background is in psychology and research and statistics, and I'd worked a lot in the type of field that CultureAmp was trying to disrupt. So in a sense, I was sort of moving across from the dark side, but I like to think that I was, coming from the dark side to the good side, really. So I ended up realizing that I was either going to be one of the types of businesses disrupted by something like CultureAmp, or I was going to go join a company like CultureAmp.
Sure. So I know we've spoken briefly about what you were doing your research in, but do you want to share a little bit more about what that involved?
Yeah. So my original academic research was in probably could be described as educational psychology. So it was a mixture of technology and psychology. So I had taken assessments or tests that children were doing within schools, etc., to sort of assess whether they might have a reading problem or an educational problem, and what might underlie that. And what I found was that the children would often become incredibly bored doing the tests, and we had to keep retesting them. So we weren't necessarily measuring what they could do, but measuring what they felt like doing on the day based on how motivated they were. And so my response to that was, well, one of the things that kids were getting really excited about was jumping on a computer. They thought it was going to be a game. And so I realized I really needed to make those tests like games, and not just describe it as a game, but it actually needed to feel like a game to the kids taking those tests. So my PhD research was basically developing game-like prototypes for those educational assessments.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's some of what you're sort of applying now into CultureAmp as well.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's that mixture of I've always been really excited about using technology to do research better, or to do statistics better, or any of the things that I learnt how to do at university and then in workplaces afterwards. I always saw that technology seemed to be a really obvious enabler and amplifier of what we could do. And so that's very much what we do in CultureAmp. Is, it's in the name. You're using technology to try and amplify culture and grow and scale culture.
Absolutely. I feel like if anyone's been listening to the podcast for any length of time, they would know how much I love CultureAmp as well, and I've spoken about it several times. But for those people that maybe aren't as familiar with CultureAmp and how it works, do you want to give a sort of a brief breakdown of the company?
Yeah, sure. So we've created a software platform whereby, if you think Google were the kind of leaders in people analytics, so Google internally built tools to ask people what made great managers, and they built tools internally to ask what was so great about working at Google, or what could be done to improve, etc. And then for most other companies, they don't have Google's resources, so they can't build all of those tools and build all of those things in. And in a lot of ways, Culture Amp is a tool that enables any company to do that kind of internal research about their culture. So we create a platform. It's a place where we provide people with pre-existing templates of feedback surveys, etc., that have been designed using modern psychology, and they can use that as a starting point to start to do that research within their own companies. And a platform provides analytics around that, provides benchmarks, and deals with a whole range of other things such as confidentiality, etc., which are really important in getting employee feedback within organisations.
Sure. So, obviously, culture is such a topic that I feel like is on top of the mind when it comes to both startups and in the corporate space as well. How do you effectively measure the culture of an organisation? Yeah,
so we try to tackle it in lots of different ways. So obviously there's many definitions of culture and what organisational culture is. And we've very much, because there are so many different ideas about it and it's constantly evolving, we've tried at Culture Amp to be fairly, I'd started off calling it model agnostic. So we're never selling a model of what culture is or a model of what culture should be within a company. But instead, really understanding that there are many aspects of culture you can measure, and we try to measure as many of those as possible to build up a really rich picture of what it's like to be in a company and what types of things matter to the people within that specific organisation. So how do you effectively measure it? You try really hard to get a lot of richness in all the things you're asking and really use the data to direct you to the next thing you want to find out. So it's a big journey, and there are some starting off points, and we have those in the platform. So there are certain things we know are really crucial to measure. So it's crucial to measure things such as how people feel about the leadership and the vision in the organisation. And we know that it's super important these days that people feel like they're learning and developing and progressing as individuals, not just for the company, but for themselves. People want, high performing people love achieving things, and so they want their company to be seen to be achieving as well. So there's a whole range of things like that, but then there are so many other things and little nuances to it. I think we're finding new things to measure about cultures every day, actually. So there's not a single day when we don't look in our platform and someone's measuring something new that we haven't seen before. So
that's great. Obviously this is going to be a really open-ended question, but what does good culture look like? I was actually just looking at some data, and this was a company, obviously won't be able to name the company, but this was a company that looked like it had a great culture. And you could just see things in the quantitative data. So that's a company in which, the great majority of people really believed in the vision of the leaders and the purpose of the organisation. That's a huge thing. So great culture always looks like it's unified around some type of vision or idea for what they're doing and a purpose for what they're doing. That's always there. Again, it's always something that feels mutual. So the company has goals and the company's achieving things, but people feel like they're buying into that and they're looked after and listened to, etc., as part of that journey too. So there's that mutuality, like any good relationship. So I think good cultures often really have that mutuality to them, where there's something that people are giving and contributing to the company, and then something they're mutually getting out of that as well. And that's fairly common in good cultures, I think. Sure. And again, we've kind of, obviously on the podcast and generally around the ecosystem, we talk a lot about, from a founder's perspective, of how big of a problem it is to hire great people.
Yeah.
And you were actually the first hire at Culture Amp.
Yeah, that's right.
First
Yeah.
full-time hire.
Yeah. Yep.
So I guess from your perspective as well, what was that process like in deciding to join the company, and what kind of pushed you to want to join Culture Amp at such an early stage?
Yeah, so some of it, I would say, a portion of it is intrinsic to me. So as in I was in a position or in a stage of my life where I wanted to do something a bit different, and was really interested in, I could see the future of my profession, etc., being taken over by technology. And so I really wanted to be at the forefront of that, given it was something that I'm really excited about. I thought, well, why don't you just do it? You can see, you'll shoot yourself if you look back in 10 years' time and go, I should have done something different, given that I was excited by it and I could see it. But then on the other hand, there was other things like I remember just being I was really impressed by the founders and how quickly they acted and how agile they were able. When I started working a little bit with them without joining, as a way to kind of test what it might be like and what it would be like to work with these people. And yeah, I guess I was really, really drawn by the kind of passion and energy to actually do something, which is quite rare if you work in a traditional company. You don't sort of see that people moving on something so quickly and creating something so quickly. So I think that it's probably one of the key things that would attract people to work for a startup, is that ability to show someone, hey, we can do something together really fast and learn really fast and build something really quickly. And for a lot of people, I think can be pretty exciting when you've come out of a traditional corporate type background,
Sure.
etc.
Well, so you mentioned that you had a period of time where you were working or helping Culture Amp without necessarily joining. Did you know at that time that you were thinking about joining the company, or was it just more to help because you had a...
Yeah, it was a bit of a mutual thing where I said, hey, let's just try this for a little bit, see how we work together. I'll help out. And I think more of it was like mutually, let's see how this idea goes, and whether I'm the right first employee for you to have. So I wanted to feel like I was contributing. Otherwise, I felt like I would go off and do something else where I could contribute more. But it wasn't very long. It was only like 3 or 4 weeks, and we went, hey, this is really working nicely. Then I joined part-time and was going to do some other kind of work, which I think is fairly common in startups. People mix a bit of consultancy with what they're doing, and that's both a positive and sometimes a disadvantage, just having that division of focus. But it happened fairly quickly. Really enjoyed working with the team, and I think also that we got some traction with the product fairly early. So we said, hey, no, we really should just jump on this and see where we can go with it.
Sure. Again, there's so much talk about how do you find co-founders and how do you find the first few hires, and especially really talented people. I think one of the common issues that comes up when I ask founders who are going through that scale phase is it's really hard finding and attracting the right sort of people.
Yeah.
And a lot of that discussion I feel has been more based from a founder perspective, like what are things that we can offer people to come and join our company. From your perspective, what are things? And obviously you touched on a few of them of the speed of growth and just the opportunities that were there. What were some of the things that that attracted you specifically to Culture Amp, and what are things on a more general level do you think that would help founders at an early stage, so the stage that potentially Culture Amp was when you first joined, to help them bring on the right talent?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the key things is I think a lot of transparency is needed. So I think there's this founder, first employee. There can be like a fairly big, just a psychological divide in the way that the types of individuals think of themselves and their role in the organisation. So I think the first thing is transparency, and that can mean founders sort of explaining their situation and even being vulnerable enough to say, hey, I'm a founder, but hey, I've got my house, mortgage to pay for this type thing, or we've got some funding, just being really clear about that side of things. And I think it's important for people joining an early stage company, or if they are taking a risk as well, potentially. It's not all risk. Sometimes some people may see that this is a positive for their career as well, and I would encourage people to view it that way too. So spending a time working in a startup can be really great for your career, even if it doesn't work out, because you're going to get a lot of experiences that you wouldn't have got elsewhere. But I think you need to then be transparent on both sides and have a plan. So, hey, we don't know if this is going to work out. If we get to this stage, then this is what we will do, to involve you potentially, equity-wise, etc. And just having a fairly clear plan about that, and just making sure that that's done fairly reasonably formally, so that there's no doubt, in the person's mind. So I think that's really an important, often not talked about aspect of it, because there's a lot of misconceptions on both sides. Some people feel like founders are obviously in some it's so much better position to be in, but often they're wearing a lot more of the risk financially. And then on the other side, founders, because they're so aware of that risk, they don't feel like for employees should necessarily be looking at equity straight away. But I think they maybe not, but they need a plan for how this will progress if things go well. So
yeah, speaking of risk, I think you just touched on that, which was potentially you're not taking on as much risk as founders, but an early employee is still taking on risk. You're still getting paid below market wages and all of those things. And, even with a startup, you're not sure how that's going to work out. And, if 6 months down the line, you're going to have a job. So I think what you just said about, having a clear plan of progression and what that sort of looks like and being transparent is really, really critical when it comes to those things. So obviously from your first hire, there are now 150 plus people at Culturehome?
Yeah, I think I lose track. I think it's like going to be 150 in the next weeks. So it's pretty close. At the moment we're in a bit of a hiring phase, so there are people coming in every week.
Yeah.
So I think we're about to hit it, or if not there. So
yeah. So how has the company and your role over that time period changed?
It's changed fairly dramatically in different seasons of the organisation. So my role initially was really being all of the domain expertise for the organisation. So the founders were, predominantly from tech and business backgrounds, and then I was from the IO Psych background. So early on, there was a lot of, I remember feeling quite challenged and almost vulnerable to be the person who was meant to make all of our survey templates and all of our content, and and then feeling, typically as an academic, I would have collaborated with, had this other team of academics, etc., to talk about, and my role was very much like just making decisions, on a fairly daily basis. No, we're going to do it this way, and this will be the best way to do this. One of the things that has changed is over time we've been able to bring more people in my domain and in IO Psych and data science, etc. So that's really nice. I really enjoy that now, having people to collaborate with and bounce ideas off. And certainly could do that with the founders, but it's not quite the same as having people from the same sort of background and domain expertise as yourself. That changed. And then early on, as well as that, there was very much like any startup, it was actually, and I guess this is one of the key things about it, one of the things to attract early employees too, is that you're going to be doing sales, and you're going to be doing implementations with customers. In our case, we're business to business, so therefore we're often involved in implementing and working with people in businesses. So I was doing all of those different types of tasks, and it was a global company very early on, so there was lots of working very odd hours around the place, etc. And in a lot of ways now that's changed. So we have offices around the world, so a lot of the pressure and stress of working, or this necessity to work out of hours all the time, has gone away. And Then the other thing, the main thing that happens after the funding is very much this hiring focus. So, to get all your colleagues in my domain expertise, I had to hire lots of people in that sort of domain. So that was the next shift, when you start to focus on hiring people and realising how long that takes and how difficult that is, and hiring at a fairly rapid pace as well, which I've hired people and managed people before, but not quite at the pace that you're going when you're in a growth stage of a startup. So you're really sort of hiring 3 or 4 people at a time, and then there's the next 3 or 4 people that you're hiring. So that's another way that the role changed.
What have been some of the challenges of growing the business that quickly?
Realising what your role is. So you often spend a lot of time thinking about bringing people in. And for me, with my background, I was always thinking about those people's roles. So like as an IA psychologist, and we collect all this data, I know that, okay, career development for people is extremely important, and leadership and management's really important. So I'm really focused on other people's roles and what their career progression is, and what they're doing day to day, and what they'll be doing next, and what things they love doing, and helping them have that as best I can through the company. And you often forget your own role. So you sit back and go, wow, I'm doing all of these things, and I never stop to ask myself, like, what it is what really excites me in my role, and what types of things I would like to do more of, etc. So I think that is a big challenge. As an early employee, you certainly do whatever you go through a phase where you do whatever it takes, because there isn't any choice. But as the company gets larger, you need to realise, oh wow, there are options for you, and it can be hard to stop and think about your own development or your own progression.
Sure. As you grow over time, has what you've looked for in people changed from the early, say, 10, 20 employees to what you look for now?
Almost certainly. I mean, there are some things that are the same. So some of the values pieces in the company. So at Culture Ramp, from even when there was 4 or 5 of us, it was very collegiate, a big focus on learning, trusting each other to make decisions. Some of the things that became the values of the organisation, and they're things I think that we looked for in early employees as well. But they tended to be, you would definitely, probably looking back, really be hiring people who could really just quickly get things done. Generalists in some cases, specialists in other cases, and really, really. And a lot of the early people we hired were engineers, etc. And because we were really just building this product and leaving the rest of us early employees to do all the rest of everything. So all the sales, all the admin, etc. And we needed to really get the engineering going to keep up with what we were selling and what we were doing in the market. And then, of course, now we hire a much broader range of people, and much more specialised in some cases. So that's really changed. And then I think the other thing now is that we're at 150 people, and we want to be 300 in a year's time, and 500. And so now we're also bringing in people, a few people who are reasonably senior, who've done this before. And that's just so that we feel a bit safer, that we've got some, in some ways this Culture Ramp is the first startup I've been involved in, and we've succeeded to this point. So we're definitely still, we still feel like we've got a long way to go before we can say we've actually made it to anywhere. And that's important. It's often people join a company and you've got funding, they think you've already made it. No, you're just on the next part of this journey. But for us, it's really important, to try and get some experience in the organisation for this, to help us at this next stage, people who've seen it go really well, and even some people who've seen it not go so well in their experience.
If there's one thing that you could have changed through this process, what would that be?
Through which part? The whole of it?
Yeah, I guess the growth of the company to this point. Was there any particular thing that you wish you did differently, or
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is. There are lots of things that we have learnt, and I just wish that I knew them beforehand. So I mean, without going into specifics, because it won't make sense to any listeners if I talk about particular, things we did in a product, etc. But in hindsight, and maybe it's only possible in hindsight, I really wish we had a stronger focus earlier on, so that we kind of went, okay, this is the most successful part of what we're doing. And although certain clients want us to move off a bit in this direction or a bit in that direction, that we didn't. And it might be because we didn't have funding for a few years, and that was conscious decision as well, which I think was a really good positive thing for us. So we didn't get a stream of venture capital money before we knew much about what we were doing. So it's good that we were more mature. But I think that made us a little bit, because we didn't have that venture capital, we were a bit more, we'd just be led along by our clients a little bit, because we'd be like, hey, here's a big client working with us and they think this is really important. And I think we made a few kind of moves in that direction that in retrospect, if we had have just really focused on the core of what we were doing and doing really well, that would have been beneficial.
I think that focus is such an underrated part of it. Like I think you mentioned earlier, at the very early stages, a lot of founders or early hires are mixing consulting with their business. I mean, at Playbook Media, we do a lot of focusing for founders. That's the initial step of like what's actually working, and make sure you double down on that versus trying to do 20 things pretty average, do one or two things really well. But often it's hard. There are specific things that you can measure, like marketing. You can measure what your conversions are.
Yeah.
For other things like product, potentially, or when you're getting feedback, it's so easy to get pulled into different directions.
Yeah.
With things. So, do you have any recommendations on how founders can come up with the right decision on what to focus on?
I would. I mean, one of the key ways is to really be super hard. And I won't often say this about other areas of the business. I certainly don't think you would set your company vision by recourse to revenue or numbers, etc. But I think it can be really helpful when, as you're growing and you look at something that someone's asking you to do, and to take a good, hard, look at it and say, well, how much really is that potentially worth as a proportion of what we really truly imagine, our product to be in 2 years or 3 years' time. And, if you think it's going to be worth, 20%, then it probably doesn't deserve much of a focus. So I'd probably really ask yourself very realistically, although this looks good now, does it match our vision of what we imagine our product to be in 2-3 years' time? And if it doesn't, then even if it's worth 20% of your revenue, it probably deserves like 0.1% of your time and focus, I would say. And that can be a hard decision when, at the time, that revenue, looks quite important. So
yeah,
that would be one way. But again, I think just really, and this is why, having that really, making sure you're always sticking to that product vision and reminding you what got you excited about that vision, and are the things you're focusing on really aligned with that initial vision, so that you're always checking that you're going to be happy with what you're doing now in 2 or 3 years' time. So that's why that vision's important. And it doesn't mean you don't go back and check it again, but definitely use that to guide you all the time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's almost that balance of sticking to your vision and that core of what you have with taking on feedback. So obviously you can't be reactive to every single bit of feedback that you have from customers about product features and those sort of things. But if enough people are saying the same sort of thing, and your gut's telling you and the revenue's telling you, that's potentially, as you mentioned, something to dive into a little bit deeper.
Yeah. I think it's also a little bit, it's probably one of the key differences too with business to business startups versus business to consumer, or sort of mass mobile app type thing. So when you're creating something and you've got 200,000 users and you get feedback from 20% of them, that's a pretty strong signal, that's telling you, oh wow, that's 20% of 200,000 people. Sorry to get a bit statistical, but then when you're in your B2B environment, you've got this other thing playing out where you may only have a handful of companies who are clients, and some of them pay more than others, which doesn't tend to happen when you've got a mobile app. Most people are paying some unit price, and at volume. And so you've got this additional challenge when you're doing B2B, which is, are we overweighting the feedback from this company who's paying us a bit more or paying a lot more than your other customers? And if there's only 12 of them, how strong a signal is a signal from your first 12 customers? And so you have to keep asking yourself, are our first 12 customers likely to be exemplars of the customers we have when we've got 1,000 companies using the product as well? So I think there's an additional challenge. And we also have so much talk now about being data-driven. And, sometimes I think that's overplayed. We constantly think, we've got to make data-driven decisions. So what is the data? And so we defer to data from 6 people, and that's not necessarily data. So
yeah, absolutely. Everyone's got access to the same data. Is that data useful first of all, and what are the insights that you're gleaning from that? Absolutely. Speaking of early customers, obviously for any B2B business, one of the toughest challenges is getting your first few customers on board. Do you want to talk a little bit about the process and what were some of the things that worked well and potentially didn't work well for Culture Amp when you were going out and selling the product?
Yes, I mean, our very first customer, I still consider them a customer. It was the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which is a not-for-profit. And we did the work for them for nothing. And that was and the reason for that was so valuable for us is we wanted to really try what we were building in the real world, and we wanted to see how this would really work in the real world. So we did that, and I think it's a really important opportunity. I think for a lot of startups that not-for-profits and other organisations can be a great way to test, or go out and say, hey, would you use this for real, and really test something in the wild, and at the same time you're doing something potentially really nice by helping that organisation out, because they probably don't have many resources. So I think it's a really an important opportunity that companies can often use, that B2B clients in particular can use. From there, one of the things we really tried to do was we went out and kind of just Didier and myself in particular kind of just used our networks. We got prototypes up, screenshots, etc. Didn't build everything out in great detail, but quickly went out and just tried to get meetings with any CEO or COO of even small organisations or not-for-profits or just anyone we could, and just got in front of them and really said, hey, if this did this and this did this, would you buy it? They might say, what price? And we'd say, any price, like $2,000. Like, we sort of fixed a fairly low minimum, and we really wanted to test whether they would buy this at some price. And that was, for us, that was really important, just to set some price on it, see if someone would buy it. Then we went and built it, then went back and said, hey, we've built this, will you buy it? Even at a fairly, for what we do and for the industry, a fairly small price. And so that was a key thing we did. And a lot of those clients did, people bought and started using the product at that very low price. So that worked really well. The other key thing that we did was tried to be fairly sensitive to where we were having success. And we didn't mind using, classic sort of sales tactics like outward bound calls and outbound emails. And, we didn't often, I think a lot of startups sometimes think it's all about oh, we'll have a really, really awesome website and generate some social media attention and and that may work for some things, but it doesn't always. You shouldn't underrate just your classic phoning people up, doing outward bound sales in emails, phone calls, networking, going to meet people. We certainly did lots of that, did a lot of hustling. We would go to make trips to San Francisco as we saw that we were getting good interest in tech companies, in particular in the Valley. And I think it's a disruptor to the space. They were the types of companies who were really interested in doing something different, or perhaps they'd never seen anything the traditional way. So for them, this was the way they wanted to get feedback about their cultures via using a platform rather than a consultant. And once we saw we had a bit of success there, we'd sort of just fly there and do big outward email campaigns, just trying to reach out and let those companies know that we were there and we did this. And that was really, one, it was lots of fun. One, we got lots of feedback about the platform just from having those meetings, and people, by just putting a little bit of hustle on it, we managed to get quite a few good early clients through some of those techniques.
How strategic was it to focus on startups and not-for-profits? Because obviously not-for-profits, as you mentioned, startups are looking for something that's disruptive and innovative. Not-for-profits in general have limited resources.
Yep.
And so they're governed a little bit more by what can we get at kind of the lowest price.
Yeah,
Was that sort of an accidental kind of strategy that you guys stumbled on, or was it more, we've identified these particular areas to start off with?
The not-for-profit, I would say, was accidental. It was triggered a little bit by that initial client we started working with, which was a relationship that I had. I'd been not asked if I could do some free work to help them with this. But after that, I think some of it was just in the first batch of CEOs that Didier and myself had some connection with. We kind of learnt that they were really more open to it than a lot of the other, people in finance or legal or other industries. And we didn't stop to think about it till we started to get a few customers from there sort of more quickly than we did in other industries where we thought they would have plenty of money for this stuff. We actually know that in finance there's, large amounts of money spent on getting culture feedback, and quite large budgets in some cases relative to not-for-profits, but not-for-profits were taking it up. And we just learned by accident that, wow, they are being forced to be more innovative because they've got less resources, which seems fairly obvious in hindsight, but we didn't strategically work that out till it happened. The tech thing, I think that was a little bit more strategic. We had sort of we started to learn here in Australia in particular that a lot of companies were a little bit risk averse. You're a new company, they traditionally just like to use the safe companies that they've always used for this, and they're worried that the board members will say you should have used X company, which seems peculiarly Australian. And the initial uptake from tech companies in the US in particular was just so much more enthusiastic and responsive by contrast. And we had suspected a little bit of that, but although it was strategic, we were surprised by how big a difference there was in that market. And then that became very early on, well, let's double down on that strategy because it's really, paying dividends. And we're also doing more exciting work with those companies as well. So they were, because they were innovative companies, they were really interested in doing really innovative things in terms of culture measurement as well. And they were growing so incredibly fast too. So they realised, wow, we've got to measure. We can't just measure once a year. We've got to measure every few weeks because we've got new people coming in every week, new people coming in every quarter. And so it was at a confluence of things, much more interest in that vertical, and also it was much more, just a lot of fun for us too. So we've grown up with a lot of those fast-growing companies. So Pinterest started using our platform when they had 60 people, and Airbnb, I think, started when there was 400 or 500. They've got thousands now, and a whole range of other companies like that we were able to kind of grow with them in that next stage of their journey too.
How important was that credibility of getting those companies on board in terms of being able to then scale that, especially when you're looking at the Australian market, which, as you mentioned, might be slightly more conservative?
Well, it was really important. It's probably grown in importance. I think there are some sectors here, the tech sector, some parts of the finance sectors, and some other people, depending on the individual in the organisation, who knew who Airbnb was and who knew who Etsy were, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was really important there. They're like, hey, you must be doing really innovative things. These are, really fast-growing tech companies, and that was important. It's probably more important now because those companies are even more known, and they're also more and more known for doing innovative things culture-wise, and even the way their offices look and the kind of perks they provide to their employees. So it was really important part of our journey. It was also a bit of a snowball effect for us as well too. So, we have a lot of that curiosity effect where people are like going, hey, you're working with this company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're like, really curious to know what those companies do. And even though we can't tell them, they, it felt right for them to be, at least working with us.
Sure. On that note, Jason, thanks so much for sharing your experience and insights on the show today. For anyone that wants to find out more, say hello, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can get in touch with me at jason@cultureamp.com if they have any questions, and on Twitter at Dr. Peoplegeek.
Perfect. I'll make sure those links are in the show notes. Jason, once again, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to episode 70 of the Startup Playbook podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Jason, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 71 in a few weeks.